in this presentation is I'm not going to give a rundown of all the concentrations and the tables of heavy metals found in different parts of the country or the world. I don't want that to happen. We have already seen that happening many times. I don't want to showcase how many times the concentration levels have been breached as compared to ANZAC guidelines and all that stuff. So here I want to talk more about the solutions, how to identify them, and what kind of interventions we can bring in, and what kind of systems exist for us to help in decision making when it comes to managing heavy metals in our urban waterways. Just to kickstart things, first of all, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Susanna and Rose, who have helped me a lot for this webinar to come true, because we've been having this idea for many months now, and Rose has kindly made it happen. So thank you very much, Rose, and my MD, Susanna, for allowing me to give this series of webinars. I'm also thankful to my colleague, John, who has involved me in many of the projects where I could apply some of the concepts which I'm going to share with you in terms of metals and modeling and management and others. So the outline of the talk is going to be along these lines. We anyway have lots of problems in terms of water quality in New Zealand. We are anyway grappling with the 4 major contaminants: bacteria, sediments, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So millions of dollars of research is being poured into trying to address the challenges from these 4 contaminants. So why add one more challenge by talking about heavy metals and trying to address heavy metal problems in the waterways? Are they really problematic, and what can be done around it? So I want to just give a motivation or background about these heavy metals. We'll talk briefly about the sources of heavy metals in the waterways, especially in the urban areas. Many of you might already be familiar with it, just so that we are on the same platform. I try to talk about their fate in terms of both monitoring and possible modeling, so that we can understand where they end up in and how they end up in different aquatic receiving environments, and what kind of mitigation options and systems do we have so that we can manage them sustainably in our urban waters. So that's the outline of the talk. Just to start with, not a fun fact, but something tragic happened a couple of weeks ago, I believe. This came out in the news, even in New Zealand news, that a California engineer with a PhD in material sciences, he tried to poison his colleague with toxic amount of cadmium, which is a heavy metal, by the way. So he did not pour high levels of cadmium immediately at once and made sure that the food or water is contaminated, but rather he took this action over a course of 18 months, apparently, where he kept on adding small amounts of cadmium day by day, and the co-worker started experiencing significant health problems as a result of which, including vomiting and diarrhea, and she was even admitted for emergency care and stuff. And cadmium, when taken in chronic levels for chronic time at high levels, can cause kidney damage and also damaging lungs when exposed to the gaseous phase. So heavy metals are toxic. It's not just bacteria which we should be worried about in terms of risks, in terms of exposure, but also in terms of heavy metals. We might not worry that they are in small amounts, so why worry about it? But small amounts over a long term can actually add up, and that would cause significant health problems. So we should be wary about that. The most important factor when it comes to heavy metals is because they are non-biodegradable, they bioaccumulate in the food chain. Now, this was a paper which was just published not more than a year ago, where they tried to study such persistent pollutants, non-biodegradable pollutants like heavy metals and like emerging contaminants in the aquatic food chain. And they found that it can actually accumulate up to 1 million times, starting all the way from the plankton phase all the way to a lipid in killer whales. And since these things are non-biodegradable, they can be present in the environment for many, many decades. So as they are getting accumulated in the food chain, they get biomagnified. And if we end up eating these biomagnified levels in our kai, in our aquatic food, definitely we are going to accumulate the heavy metals in our bodies as well. So these heavy metals can affect us in terms of human health, in terms of environmental health, even in terms of the species richness levels. In terms of bioaccumulation, US EPA Ecotox database has hundreds of tables, which tells you how, for example, a heavy metal like zinc, how it can get bioaccumulated in different species like algae or invertebrates or mollusks. So the conclusion is that definitely there is biomagnification happening in the relevant food chains, and it can happen to very high levels, and we should watch out for it. So as I said, the impact on human health can be affecting the formation of blood cells or affecting the liver function or the kidney function. And something which was studied extensively because of mercury poisoning was even low levels of mercury poisoning over long term can be very dangerous in terms of liver and brain damages, especially for pregnant women. It can cause birth defects in the children. In terms of animal health, sure, lots of ecologists among you would identify that heavy metals are not good at chronic level because they are very reactive with metabolically active tissues, especially gills, skin, and alimentary canal, and livers and stuff. And studies have shown, even in New Zealand, studies on ecotoxicology of heavy metals and bioaccumulation has been going on for more than 30 years. The first paper I saw was dating back to 1980s. Maybe there are some papers even before that, which talk about how heavy metals get bioaccumulated in different kinds of invertebrates and birds and fishes, and how they affect the different parts, different organs of those particular organisms. It seems age plays a role, the season in which you try to identify the levels of bioaccumulation of heavy metals, that plays a role. The gender plays a role, the feeding habits play a role. So different aspects. And when it comes to the species richness or community structure, I even came across a master's thesis, I believe, which was published from University of Canterbury a few years ago, which talked about the presence of heavy metals and their impact on the macrovertebrate index, the MCI. And they found out, as part of that research, the abundance has reduced a lot, the community structure has changed a lot. And they also found out that some heavy metals can displace sensitive species, which cannot tolerate those chronic levels of heavy metals in the waters, be it in the water column or in the sediment column. And that can affect the ecosystem processes because they're displaced by species which are tolerant to such high levels of heavy metals. So having the motivation covered on why it is important to talk about heavy metals. Now it's important to know the source of these contaminants, where they're actually coming from. So they can come from different sources, especially in urban areas, be it from the motor vehicles, be it from the buildings, be it from the construction areas, or even from the landfill leachate. And we have hundreds of them which have not been properly secured, as can be seen in the previous weeks. So 2 weeks ago, there was a huge storm in the west coast of New Zealand, and a landfill got just opened up, and the debris was washed away, and it was found even 50 to 100 kilometers downstream of the landfill. So depending upon the conditions of the receiving environment, you can find them anywhere, and they can pose risk, not just in terms of gross pollutants, but also in terms of the micro levels which are available. If you want to talk specifically about heavy metals like copper and zinc, which have been found and reported extensively in the New Zealand State of the Environment reports or Parliamentary Commissioner reports, or even in international reports talking about pollution in New Zealand waterways, we can find that, again, urbanization-induced impacts like industrial activities and infrastructure and the roads associated with it, and the kind of paints and the kind of metals used during in the historic times, how they are still persistent in the environment. A lot of research has been carried out by Tom Cochrane's group in University of Canterbury, where they have actually quantified the amount of heavy metals being generated from different surfaces, be it different types of roofs or car parks or roads. And they actually quantified them not just on an annual basis, but also on a per storm event basis. I'll come back to this later on when we talk about solutions and systems. Now, why we are very worried about is because this particular table, which I found in the National Performance Review report, talks about the actual number of discharge outlets in each of the cities in New Zealand. And these cities which you find here in this table are the cities with the maximum population in the country. And you find that the more population you have, the more infrastructure you have, and the more stormwater discharge outlets you have. And if they're not properly maintained, just like this example, which was in New Zealand Herald not too long ago about a stormwater outlet in Napier, you are not only going to suffer the consequences of having these gross pollutants, but also all the metal levels, heavy metals, or the micropollutants which are present in the environment, which don't biodegrade and which get bioaccumulated over the food chain. So this is just an example of the copper and zinc levels in Auckland's freshwater streams, and how, as compared to the native forest levels or the rural areas, urban areas definitely are contributing more in terms of both copper and zinc in both acute and chronic levels. Now, this impact of urbanization on waterways is something which we cannot avoid, just how this DIPSR framework shows, because the more people you have, definitely there's going to be infrastructure pressure in terms of more buildings, more imperviousness, and that would cause more point and diffuse source of pollution. So your whole water cycle, hydrological cycle is changing because of increased runoff. And if they're not being if there are not enough mitigations and interventions at the source, or even at the end of the pipe treatment solutions, you're definitely going to get decreased water quality. And the kind of response you get, that's something which depends on the kind of organisms present in the receiving environment. So you're talking about streams or lakes or rivers or even coastal environment. So every species has their own way of responding to the different levels, be it acute or chronic levels of heavy metals present in the environment. So, and that's a big question. Which species should we save, which species should we not, or should we just go for the ANZAC recommended 95% species protection or 90% species protection? It all depends upon the questions which you want to address for that particular target catchment or target receiving environment of interest. Something which came into which came as a tube light for me in the past few months. I've been working on this heavy metal modeling. Was initially when I was doing my PhD or working with ecotoxicologists, the focus has always been on the bioavailable metal, which is freely available in the water column. Like, say, for example, in this particular slide, it shows the freely available zinc. So there was not much focus on the zinc complex, be it in the organic form or be it in the complex in the colloidal form, or even in the particulate form, which is attached to the sediments based on adsorption and desorption properties. Because we were more worried about what's happening in the water column, and we didn't worry so much about what was happening in the sediment column. But the more and more literature I dig, and the more and more I identify, it's like we are just trying to save the species present in the water column, but we are not really worried about the shellfish which feed on the sediments in the sediment column. And if you have a lot of metal accumulation in the sediment column, that's definitely going to affect a lot of shellfish, which really don't have any kind of mechanisms to cope with heavy metals. They can't really filter out heavy metals. And when such kind of shellfish is consumed either directly by humans or by fin fish and then consumed by humans, definitely a lot of bioaccumulation is going to happen for these non-biodegradable contaminants in the environment. In terms of fate, we can study fate in multiple levels. We can either study them or investigate them in terms of steady state concentration using mass balance approaches. So you know how much load is entering into that particular water body of interest, and what is the retention coefficient for that particular metal in that water body. Based on the water depth and hydraulic residence time, you'd be able to compute the steady state concentration. Now, that's very easy. You don't really need to have a very difficult, very complex model just to identify how much amount of heavy metal concentration is going to be in your target water body. You can just go with a mass balance approach. But I've seen multiple levels of complexity in terms of mass balance approach. Mel Green at NEVA, he has done amazing work when it comes to studying the fate of heavy metals in coastal waters, especially metal concentration in the sediment being deposited. And he has carried out lots of research and applied it in lots of studies, including Waitemata and Kaipara and Akura and other kind of studies, Porirua and others. So his mass balance approach for steady state is identifying how much amount of loads are coming, are getting deposited into the sediments in the coastal waters on a per year basis, and then trying to quantify in terms of sediment mixed layer, how much amount of metal is going to come from the catchment, how much amount of metal is there in the sediments entering from the catchment into the sediment, into seabed, and how much amount of mass of metals are already there in the seabed. So based on that, based on the mass balance concept, he came up with a relationship in terms of what is the concentration of the metal in the deposited sediment. Are also concentration of metal at the end of year one, say, for example, if you're looking at steady state for year one. He has come up with further derivations of this equation in terms of, let's say you're interested to know the fate of these heavy metals, how much accumulation is taking place over several years, not just over 1 year. He has beautiful relationships. We have applied them, and then we have seen them, like say, for example, happening in one of the estuaries here in New Zealand, where we can actually determine the concentration levels in the sediments of, say, for this example, heavy metal zinc, happening across the next 55 years, starting all the way from 2010 to 2065. Definitely with some assumptions, we can see how the heavy metal concentration is getting accumulated in the sediments in this particular area in the estuary. Now, all these are possible with steady state, mass balance types of approaches. Mass balance is the key for everything, be it steady state or be it dynamic relationships. But then there is always a risk associated with such steady state models, because when you have repeated discharges entering into your receiving environment, you're not really sure when the organism is able to fully recover from one event and is able to tolerate the next onset of heavy metal dose which is coming in. And these metals, they can keep on getting built up in the sediments and not necessarily in a linear fashion. It could be exponential, it could be logarithmic, it could be in different fashions. So it's really important to know how the metal accumulation is changing on an event-to-event basis rather than just on an annual basis or taking a long-term view of it. I mean, definitely they have specific advantages in terms of trying to compute the potential toxicity, but when you want to really know how dynamically the system is changing and the effect it is having on the aquatic biota on an event-to-event basis, you need dynamic representations and dynamic relationships for that mass balance. DHI has an amazing tool called MyEcolab, which can help you quantify water quality in terms of different variables, especially heavy metals in both water column and sediment column. There are already established templates, and it has been proven and calibrated at both freshwater level and coastal level. So this takes into account of adsorption and desorption. It sits on top of your existing hydrodynamics model. So you're able to see at a spatio and temporal dynamic level how the concentration is changing across the receiving environment over time and across space. We have done something locally as well in partnership with the University of Canterbury, who have carried out lots of studies in terms of stormwater discharges, and they have identified the different factors which affect the buildup and wash off. And in partnership with them, we have developed a spatial decision support system, which will help in this management of these heavy metals over time and over space across every event, and help in catchment planning, help in contaminant loading, help in basically in your stormwater management plans or in your network discharge consents, all those different kinds of processes. So this system, which I'm going to share during the stormwater conference as well, it determines event-based pollutant loads in addition to annual average loads. And it integrates the local climatic conditions. So we made it as specific as possible to local climate. So we can take Auckland climate and then have specific loads generated for that, Christchurch climate or Dunedin climate, and have specific loads generated for that. And we went one step ahead and said that let's try to integrate the loads which are generated at the catchment level with the flow routing models and compute the concentrations in the waters at both total heavy metal level and then in the bioavailable fraction and in the particulate fraction. So just to give you some examples of screenshots, we can generate results. Just trying to keep it here so that you can see the results. You can see the results from each surface at an annual average level or for a specific event. Now that's very useful when you're trying to correspond what is the relevant concentration to that specific storm event and the load which is generated, and whether that specific concentration is going to affect the living biota in the target waterway of interest for you. Because when you have annual loads, it's not possible to generate load duration curves like this because you're not able to classify the different storm events in terms of the discharges in the waterways. But by having such dynamic models, it's possible to develop flow duration curves and load duration curves, which tells you how across different scenarios, whether the contaminant loading is going to be above your recommended threshold, ANZAC level recommended threshold, or it's going to be below. Just like for this example, the orange line represents the ANZAC recommended threshold, but you have different scenarios showing that even with multiple interventions, it's not possible to really have reduction in loads across different flows. If you want to quantify it from that plot to a bar plot, we can actually see how different scenarios behave across different times. So this was an example which we carried out for some part of Lower North Island. This system can help in summarizing the load generation from each subcatchment on a event level as well as on an annual level, which is very useful. And it definitely, the main purpose of it was to help in quick decision making. And we made the system in such a way that you can set up your own scenarios to have on-source reduction or end of the pipe treatment solutions, so that you can compare the scenario results directly with the baseline results in terms of the loads being generated or in terms of the concentration being generated. Like say, for example, you know that the threshold is around 3.56 milligrams per meter cube of dissolved copper, which is the in-stream guideline there at that particular base. And you know that whether this particular scenario was breaching that threshold or not. So these are the different ways in which we can, or the system can help the user identify whether the scenarios they're taking are actually helping in reducing the loads which the biota are actually facing in the waterway. In terms of mitigations and interventions, again, as I mentioned earlier, we had to be very specific on what kind of target, biota we are trying to rescue, because we need to understand what kind of relationship it has with the stressor. Is it a linear relationship or is it a logistic relationship in terms of bifurcation? So based on that relationship, we should be able to identify what kind of suitable intervention we can take in terms of adaptive management. Should it be a simple load reduction, or should it be something which can help in shifting the resistance of that aquatic biota over time, or something which can even increase the response value of the biota in terms of the stressor for the same concentration by taking some interventions in terms of adaptive management over time rather than taking a short-term view around things. Definitely, I'm a big proponent of this green infrastructure, but again, the application of this green infrastructure should be in lieu of this kind of adaptive management measures, and the system which we developed along with University of Canterbury helps in implementing it along these lines. Tom Cochrane's group has even tabulated the kind of efficiencies which you can get from different green infrastructure treatment systems, and definitely we can apply them so that we can have on-source reduction of these heavy metals in both the dissolved phase as well as in the particulate phase. We are almost coming to the end of time. Just to give a what do you call a brighter picture of things. If you are really working towards improving water clarity in our waterways, and especially if you're living near waterways, lots of research has been done in both US and Europe as well as in Japan, where they found out that the waterfront property values can actually increase by more than $500 million if you improve water clarity, depending upon what kind of improvements you're looking at. Like one standard deviation improvement in water quality can increase the prices by 32%. Now that's really great. So we really have an incentive to enhance our water quality in the waterways, if not for supporting our environment, at least to increase the property prices of the houses we live there. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for your time. More than keen to take any questions if you have. Either you can type it on the window, or you can unmute yourself and then ask me the question. That would be really great. The next webinar is on May 8th at the same time. For those who are interested, it's about modeling water quality in rivers, and what kind of modeling approach can we use for that particular thing. Is it the black box type or a white box type? We'll talk more about it next month. So thank you. If you have any questions later on, please feel free to approach me via this email as well, cmk@dhigroup.com. Thank you very much for your patience. Okay, we seem to have one question. Yeah, Ting, definitely I'm going to share these slides, no problem. Thank you. Any other questions? If you want, you can unmute yourself and ask questions, or just like Ting Powell, you can type the questions on your chat window, which is either at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen based on how you have set it up. Dragana had a question on integration of water quality models with HD models. Especially if you're looking at dynamic models, it's possible to integrate with Mike software provided by DHI in both freshwater environment and coastal environment. If you have some other models of hydrodynamics and you want to integrate water quality models on top of it, please feel free to talk. We can definitely arrange some kind of solution around that as well. If not, please enjoy your lunch on this lovely Wednesday. Thanks, Ed. Ed Clayton has a question regarding, do you know of any modeling that takes into account illicit discharges during dry weather? That is, people pouring paint or other substances into stormwater systems? That's a great question, Ed. So it depends on the kind of system you're talking about. Is it an operational system, or is it a system which you want to use for forensic analysis? I remember developing a system of this sort about 8 years ago now, between 2010 to 2012, where we were where we identified 8 different possible point source pollution sources, which can contribute contaminants to the waterways. So we applied the system in both hindcast analysis as well as for operational analysis. In hindcast analysis, we calibrated the system based on the kind of data which we surveyed and which we saw over 1 or 2 years. So having data is very important if you want to really get a good fit for the model. And in an operational sense, you have to make assumptions based on the data so that you can get realistic forecast of concentrations because of these illicit discharges. So definitely monitoring is important. But yeah, if for forensic analysis, you can always reverse engineer your models to see what could have been the possible culprit behind high levels of metals or nutrients which you saw in a particular location in your system. And that's always possible. Please let me know if you want to talk more about this. More than happy to chat about the system which we developed 8 years ago. Hope that answered your question. Right, so it's already 12:33. You all have my email ID. Please feel free to contact me if you have any more questions regarding the presentation or heavy metal modeling in general. I'll see you next time in May on May 8th. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.